And let's get into the goods. We are almost at the end of this book. We've made it. We've at least through the stories and the feelings that Lorde is trying to remember and share with us, right? We were supposed to read up to chapter 25. So I'm going to open it up with if there's anything that stood out to folks immediately. I definitely have something I wanted to review, but if there's anything that stood out to folks as you were reading, a question I guess I can also pose is, where are we now as we look at Audre in her adulthood? Where is she? Where is she in her identity? Where is she in her journey? Just like in adulthood, right? Like, does she have a job? Is she struggling? Does she feel like she knows? Do we feel like she's setting herself in her scholarly way yet? Or is she still trying to figure out what she's best at, right? What are things that stood out to folks? Yes, please.
I was a little confused about when she went to Mexico. I thought she was going on vacation, but I don't know if I missed something in the book or.
Does anyone want to clarify what they thought was happening in Mexico? Why did Audre go to Mexico? How'd she end up there?
I know she wanted to go, but I thought it was for a vacation. She saved the money, yeah, but.
Yeah, I thought she just wanted to go to experience.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
I listen. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, you go ahead. Go ahead, Anais.
No, I didn't mean to cut you off. Go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say, I didn't think there was any larger goal, although she does wind up taking classes while she's there. So maybe, you know, and I'm sure that by now, and I'm speaking about something I'm really not sure about, but it is possible that in her sort of anti-American view, and I don't say that as a negative, just the way she always lowercases America kind of says something about her feeling about this country. And a lot of people seem to have gone to Mexico who had issues with America at that time. So that could be part of it.
Absolutely. I would say that a connection that I'm making really quickly to our last book club session that had read this part, but we were discussing it again, where the folks were naming the socioeconomics around what was happening for Audre Lorde at the time and kind of what pushed her to kind of leave New York and be in a more exploratory space, and ultimately what brings her back. And folks were naming the influence of the Supreme Court decision, as well, which she notes and shares with us, as well as we get that sort of understanding of through McCarthyism, many folks are othered. And if she's already dealing with these othered identities, it would make sense probably to, if you had the means, right, to dip for a little bit. And I really think she maybe, I've done that. I've gone on vacation and I'm like, oh, I'm gonna stay here for another 2-3 weeks. Cause you know, my situation, responsibilities are limited to myself, right? I don't have children. So the idea of getting to explore a new place, I think is sort of what happens in Mexico. She just inadvertently ends up staying there for a little bit. And then by the end of the chapter, she's like, I'm coming back. Like I came back to New York in July. What were you gonna say, Anais?
Yeah, I was really glad, Ron, that you said what you just said about the whole political environment in the United States. Because I listened to I watched the video from last week's, because I wasn't able to be here last week. And I saw that we had already kind of begun to talk about the Mexico trip and why did she go. And so I was looking at that kind of before coming into the conversation. And I was actually going to speak to what you were saying, Ron, which was some insights. I think some things that stood out to me that were mentioned about that community. So I think, Ron, I think you hit it, like this community that she went to. how she got there. So I agree with everybody else. It's not really clear in this memoir that she's giving us why she went to Mexico, but how she got to be in that community, I thought was, I thought was kind of spelled out, which is, so she says that her friend Rhea, that she was living with on 7th Street, told her, oh, you should go stay with Frida. And Frida, on page 159, there's this, I did want to just kind of read it. On 159, the second paragraph, kind of a little bit down, it says, she's describing the community. And then she says, others were nurses like Frida, who had served in the Lincoln Brigade and run into trouble with the American government because of it. Members of that brigade had been granted citizenship by Mexico. I know a lot about the Lincoln Brigade, and I don't know if other people know about this. I always get very, very emotional because as a political woman, it means a lot to me. The struggles around the world where people have stood up and given their lives in the fight for freedom and against fascism. And the Lincoln Brigade were Americans who went to fight in the Spanish Civil War against the fascists and who lost their lives. 1,500 members of the international brigades, people came from all over the world, not just Americans. The Americans were the Lincoln Brigade, but people from all over the world volunteered to fight the fascists in the Spanish Civil War alongside the Spanish people. And it was a civil war. It wasn't one army against one army. It was the Spanish army against the people of Spain, who armed themselves and formed militias and fought the fascists. So I'm always very moved when, this kind of comes around in history. And so Frida was a nurse in the Lincoln Brigades. She was a communist, and that's another thing. So we know that, we discover a little later on that Rhea, because she's a member of the Communist Party of the United States, they were very homophobic, and they say that, and that's why she left for Chicago, because it really got her in trouble that she was rooming with a lesbian. And when somebody from the party came to visit Rhea, they realized, wait, this woman's a lesbian. And Rhea, rather than abandon her or kick her out, she decided to go to Chicago, to kind of still be able to do her political work. But anyway, these women that they're talking about, like you said, Ron, this was McCarthyism. This is 1952.
Yeah.
And this is the height of McCarthyism, where anybody who was a member of the Communist Party was kicked out of work, and the Rosenbergs, which is another thing very dear to my heart, these people who were sent to their death, who were electrocuted, who were set up, these Jewish communists, and I'm just going to say, because I get very emotional around this stuff, it's the one thing, not the one thing, it's one of the things I'm proud of being part Jewish, is the heritage of the Jewish communists who fought for the unions and fought for Black people and fought for integration and fought in the Spanish Civil War and gave their lives. And so this is what she came to. She came to a community of expatriates who were living in Mexico. And it said the Mexican government gave members of the Lincoln Brigade Mexican citizenship.
Yeah,
that's also very moving to me.
Yeah.
That's also very moving to me that the Mexican government, recognized their heroism and made a place for them to flee to, because they were fleeing from McCarthyism. And what we, talked about the last time is that, Audre was active in the Ethel Rosenberg Committee, in the Rosenbergs, freed the Rosenberg Committee. So she, that was the political, she got political as a very young girl, you know, when she left her family and she went to the village, and that's what was happening. You know, it's really, you know, we live in such an anti-communist country. We're so anti-communist. It's just like in our DNA. And, you know, the communists were the organizers. They were the labor organizers. They were community organizers. You know, recently, I've been coming out as, you know, kind of under the cover commie, because I've been political since I was 16. And even though I wasn't a member of the Communist Party, I was, you know, I was living the tradition of what those communists did in the 20s and the 30s and the 40s. They were the people who were fighting for workers' rights. You know, they were the people who were fighting, you know, for decency. And I just love that Audre, you know, was part of that scene, that she was influenced by that time in history and that community of people who were putting their life on the line in some cases, you know, to fight for what they believed was right. And that had a tremendous influence on her. And that was part of that formation that we talk about. And those women, Rhea, Frida, no, those were communist women. I feel like I want to say that out loud. I want to give them their due. I don't want to hide it under the rug, you know, because of the anti-communism we have in this country. I want to say kudos for who they were and how they lived their life, and that they took Audre in, and that they were loving to her, and they helped, you know, shape who she wound up to be, because she wound up being a very political woman, and we know that, you know, and that's the influence on her. Anyway, I'll get off my soapbox.
Thank you,
My
man.
soapbox.
Really,
Thank you.
Get off my soapbox.
you made it clear to me. Thank you, Anna.
Yeah, no, you also added a lot to me also, because I had assumed like these women, it felt a little privilegey how these women were living in Mexico, you know, and I assumed like they probably had a little money, and they had the ability to leave America and go to Mexico and set up their own little enclave. But you added a dimension to it that I didn't, you know, didn't see. So definitely, thank you so much.
Yes, and naming, you know, that I think I remember last week making some kind of point about like the reason why Audre chooses to write about these women. And I think I even said it on Saturday too, isn't necessarily about the interpersonal relationship, but I think I'm naming that the political mixed with the physical, mixed with the emotional, is what allows her to name herself. She then comes back to New York with a clearer sense of self. And I remember, not a challenge, but someone had said like, well, I didn't think it was that political. But thank you, Anais, because I did feel walking away from that session like, it is that political though, you know what I mean? And I think, let's read a little bit about what Audre writes herself on that very page. If we go to 159, she continues to name, for the American colony in Cuernavaca, the political atmosphere was one of guarded alertness. There was not the stench of terror and political repression so present in New York. We were 3,500 miles away. But any idea that immunity from McCarthyism might be conferred by borders had been shattered 2 years before in the minds of anyone who had ever been the least bit politically active. FBI agents had descended upon Mexico and hustled Morton Sobel, alleged co-conspirator of Ethel and Julius Rosenberg, out of Mexico and right back to the border to stand trial for treason. Caution and fear of newcomers was everywhere, mixed up with the welcoming excitement at any new face, right? So the idea that like there's still a fear and a blessing, a privilege, an opening to be able to still be able to greet people once having to be in hiding and push out, you know what I mean? I think Audre names that beautifully as well. So thank you, Anais. Anything else standing out to folks?
I also want to add to what Anais said, and I think I may have said this before, that where I live at, the Amalgamated was started by the Amalgamated Housing Corporation, was started by socialist Jews from the Amalgamated Clothing Workers Union, and they all got together and pooled their money and bought property and built a development where I live at. And it was where I live is the oldest continuously run co-op in the United States. And a few years ago, the Museum of the City of New York did an exhibition on that history, as well as 2 other developments in the Bronx, which have since converted to private ownership or regular rentals. It's no longer co-ops. So this is the only one of the original 3 still remaining. So again, it's all about Anais tonight. So
It's so interesting. I know the Amalgamated, my dear friend Isabel, who passed away a few years ago, you might know her. She lived in the Amalgamated for 20 years. She was a Puerto Rican political activist. And it's so funny because, you know, yes, that's the history of Amalgamated.
Yeah.
I always say that's where you'll find the communists. I love using I throw that word around a lot today because I feel like I'm coming out. But we went to a women's march, you know, a few weeks ago. We met all of these, you know, older, you know, women who were there in the women's march. And then we were in the Bronx, and we asked them, you know, so oh, I live in Amalgamated. I said, oh, that's where the communists live, you know, because it's got this history. It was built by the Union. And
it definitely does.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So thank you again.
And I didn't realize you lived there. That's great.
Yeah, I've been here 26 years now.
Yeah.
I just added up that in my head earlier. I was like, Jesus.
With Americo, right?
Yeah.
Americo is there too?
Americo, yeah, he lives down the street. Yeah.
Not to
Commies.
Yeah, I know.
I was gonna say, Americo's
I also
open
know
politically
Americo.
about who he is. Yeah,
That's
Americo.
I
so
don't
funny.
mind.
He goes back the way I go back. Yeah.
Yeah, it's good. It's a good back. You brought light to the story. I'm sorry, I just did not get it.
Yeah, I totally would not have gone that deep into that part. It just felt like Audre just kind of stumbled into a community of privilege of people who don't have to, well, they own shops, I think how it's told in the book. You know, they're like shopkeepers and things like that, but you definitely added a depth to that, Anais. Thank you.
And I think that's also important to note when, you know, Audre is a scholar. So I don't think she anticipates you knowing a story with all of its details. I think she wants you to then stop, research, look up, because Anais, you did give us a heart to it because we love you and you're in community with us, right? And without your perspective, she wrote it. It's not like she didn't write it. She wrote it. And for some reason, it does, you know, it lands differently for whatever our experiences are in our own lines of oppression. What you know, I've never managed to be able to leave the United States for X amount of time while shit was crazy and then come back. You know what I mean? So whatever that looks like, we then bring that into it as a reader. But she definitely writes it down. And I think like understanding who the Lincoln Brigade are and understanding what queerness, identity, again, keeping that perspective in this time frame in the 50s, in the 60s, it's important to name that it's then not far-fetched to think that even if these folks found, or if we're reading it off as privilege, what's to say that that is a safe haven in a space that they hadn't earned at that point? You know what I mean? Yeah. So remember to always, it just reminds me for myself, like hearing it, like I sometimes feel like as a well-read person, I betray myself if I come across something and it's not clear. I'm like, oh, well, they didn't make that clear. I never stopped to really think, oh, I should look up. I should look up. I should look this up. You know what I mean? So shout out to us being active readers. Ever heard that term?
There's a documentary on the Lincoln Brigade, and it was made a few years before. Most of those people are dead now, but it was made when they were like in their 80s, and like all of these interviews with all of the people who went on that brigade and who survived it.
They actually had an exhibit on the women of the Lincoln Brigade at the Bronx Museum for 2 weeks. Yeah.
Wow.
In the beginning of the pandemic, I remember. Yeah. And y'all know Stephanie Alvarado. that she's on the board for Book One Bronx, and she used to be a facilitator. I think I don't know if she's the one that told me about that or she knows the people that worked in that, but I remember her name as a connection there. All I'm saying is that it's something to look up.
That's why this book club is the bomb. We learn.
Something I want to note as well in these couple of chapters is that Audre really takes time to give us prose and tell us a story, and she's giving us less flowery language. It's still peppered in there because she can't help it, right? But she's giving us less allusions and reference and less flowery language. These recollections seem much more solid, more real. I interpret them exactly the way she tells me. If it feels less about how she feels and more about what's happening to her at the time. Would folks agree with that? I feel like in the past, her stories are centered around how she feels. And right now she's like giving us these vital times. And I think it may be, again, every time she has to name women, every time she has to name these vital characters who sort of like changed or shifted or impacted her, I think the pattern that I'm noticing is that we get the actual story as it may have happened. She'll pepper in her feelings, she'll pepper in some flowery language, but it's not the same. What happens to Audre when she gets back from Mexico? When she returns to New York, now that she's had such an impactful time in Mexico, is it smooth sailing? She went to Mexico, had this huge political experience and came back? No. What happens to her when she comes back? She struggles, right? We don't gotta know specifics, but she struggles tremendously, especially after having experiences around sexuality and learning from this entire group of women. She comes and she starts to feel, the word starts with L, rhymes with slowly. She starts to feel lonely, right? Like, I think we look at chapter 23.
I think it's the last paragraph on chapter 22. It's really page 176.
Right, but I was referring to the first paragraph of chapter 23. You talking about the last chapter of 22?
Yeah, well, what you asked, like, I returned to New York on the night of July 4th. The humid heat was oppressive after the dry, hot climate of Mexico. As I got out of the taxi on 7th Street, the sound of firecrackers was everywhere. They sounded thinner and lighter than the fireworks in Mexico. So I see a lot of symbolism here of what Mexico did to her. And she's relating very different to New York now, you know? And of course, then now we go into chapter 23. I remember how being young and Black and gay and lonely, a lot of it was fine, feeling I had the truth and the light and the key, but a lot of it was purely hell. Okay, so I think that's powerful. And I think there's a comparison contrast that she manages to make very realistic if we look at it very carefully. And I think that's truly amazing. You know, we can just go on to look at it in the next sentence. There were no mothers, no sisters, no heroes. We had to do it ourselves, like our sisters, Amazons. Okay, so she's obviously able to relate to her experience in Mexico, and she's looking at New York, she's looking at the United States with very different eyes and very different feelings, I think.
She wants that community. She wants that sense of community. She is specifically looking for Black queer women to associate with. You know, it seems that the lesbian community is I won't say dominated, but is disproportionately white, and white of beneath like 14th Street whites, like Village, you know, and she is looking for some of her uptown sisters. She's downtown, you know, living downtown. She's working uptown, but it feels like she's looking for some of her sisters to kind of form a sisters in quotes to form community with.
Wasn't there, weren't there lesbians or gays during the Harlem Renaissance?
Yes, of course.
So, and so these, was it still, what's the word? Like, she didn't know, I know this is like the 20, 30 years later, but there was no like shifting from there to during Audre's time? Just asking, because I don't know.
Well, I'm not sure the question, but we're just gonna name that homophobia has always existed. So she was dealing with that then too, you know, like in whatever period of time was happening, that was still happening. Homophobia is a principal staple in the Western United States. So it's not as if she wouldn't have to deal with that. The Harlem Renaissance was certainly occurring, and there were folks who were queer. That didn't mean they were able to be out. It didn't mean that it was necessarily safe. And I want to name that, I think she's looking for friendship and community. But she also names like the loneliness. I'm not sure if she's telling us exactly what the loneliness is. That's what I'm saying. I don't think we have to assume that it's in a relationship or it's in a friendship. I think it's in spite of how she's moving in her identity, it still feels lonely. Because she says, you know, I'm young, gay, Black, fine. I got the keys, I got the light, but it's hell, you know, because it's lonely. And she then on 177 goes on to sort of name the scene, right? And she goes, during the 50s in the village, I didn't know the few other Black women who were visibly gay at all well. Too often we found ourselves sleeping with the same white women. We recognized ourselves as exotic sister outsiders who might gain little from banding together. Let's read that sentence one more time. We recognize ourselves as exotic sister outsiders who might gain little from banding together. Perhaps our strength may lie in our fewness, our rarity. That's the way it was downtown. And uptown, meaning the land of Black people, seemed very far away and hostile territory. So again, she's telling us, we don't have to speculate, that regardless of whatever's happening at the time, the homophobia is hostile and she feels it. And while downtown, she may be able to be more in an identity, there's this racial inequity that she's noticing, and she's recognizing herself as exotic to the people that she's hanging out with. She's recognizing herself maybe fetishized, which what person of color doesn't kind of feel that way, or what person that's not a cishet white male man doesn't sometimes feel fetishized, right? So like she's naming that very relatable feeling of when you are in othered and you still are marginalized in that, it could be very lonely. And I don't know if she's actively looking, she may want it, but I think there's more of a fear around what it looks like to be in community at this age, at this time in her life with more Black queer women, because it seems like there's a, you know, like the Mason-Dixon line, but uptown, downtown. You know what I mean? It feels like there's a line that can't be crossed. Yeah, I'm making sense. Folks are nodding. Okay, good. Mason-Dixon is far off, but you know, it's not when you think just about how she
get it.
exists, you know?
Yeah.
Being an uptown native myself and going to, this is not the same at all, but this is like the closest thing I can name. Going to school since I was very young in Manhattan, even I used to feel like that divide, like once you cross the line and you come up to 125th Street, it's a different version of me versus once I had to go down past 125th Street and I had to present myself even to the people on the train cart differently because I didn't want to be othered, right? And I didn't want to be a nuisance. And I didn't want to be loud. I didn't want to be a ghetto girl, whatever. And then once I got past 125th, my friends and I were comfortable. We'll laugh loud, you know, we'll tell jokes, we'll take up a little more space. And I think she's sort of naming something similar to that, you know?
This is DFA. Can I add this?
Please, DK.
I've been feeling that she's really not connected with the Harlem or the Black community at all. She went to school where she was usually the one or one of the few Blacks in her classes. She writes about the Harlem Writers Guild, but I don't really remember her telling us how she got involved with them, how she found them, what her relationship is like with those writers. So I don't see a connect with the people above 110th Street.
Yeah.
Even though she grew up there.
Thank you.
But once she becomes of age, like 18 years old, she's out. She leaves Harlem.
Mm-hmm.
You know, she moves out immediately. She moves out of her parents' house immediately and heads downtown looking for a community, which kind of also speaks to homophobia in Black communities, as she could not feel like she could find that kind of community in Harlem that she was just dealing with the relationship with her parents, which wasn't the best. And then possibly just the Harlem or Black community itself wasn't the best community for her. So she had, 18, she heads to whatever age she was, she heads downtown. So you're right, Dife, like, when you think that your formative, how you connect to a community, I mean, sure, you connect to a community when you're young and you're a kid, but you really, build friendships and relationships, that are in the community once you are, paying rent and doing stuff like that.
Right.
And
But
she
to that
leaves.
point too, even when she was a kid, it didn't feel like she had like very few friendships. They were very rare. It didn't seem like she enjoyed school. So even like those little things about community, enjoying being able to go to the school near your house, all those things sort of affect how you see the community you lived in. And I don't even know if she had that as a kid, you know what I mean? So it allows for that disconnect. Yeah, Dife, thank you for naming that. Yeah, it feels like maybe she's not as connected. And I think, yes, Paula.
I'm just sort of struck by, remember when she was in Mexico and Eudora says, she's thinking about going back and Eudora says, I probably should have gone back and continued the struggle. And use that word, Paula, early about struggle. And she said, I didn't. And when she went to Mexico, she found a community. They were actually a community. They fought with each other, but they were a community. But it wasn't, I was sort of struck by the parallel between trying to find a community that's your community and her trying to find her name. And so, and when Eudora says that, you sort of, it's like, that must have tripped something in her brain, because she goes back when there's political changes in the United States, the Brown versus Board of Education. And she goes back and it is incredible. It's hell, as she says, and it's lonely, but the loneliness comes from not just any community, trying to find a community that she doesn't even know if it exists. And I'm sort of struck every time she goes to a bar. She doesn't really like going to bars, and she doesn't like beer, but she keeps going to those bars because that's the only way. Oh, that's it. That's the only like way to communicate among the sort of the lesbian community there, because there's no internet, there's no newspaper, there's no, there's so many ways of like not communicating, and her only chance is at those bars. So I'm sort of struck by all of her efforts to find and or create her community. And it's an American New York City intellectual, you said political, intellectual, emotional, physical. And it's so hard because there's so many barriers.
Absolutely. Thank you. Dife?
Oh, no, I was just listening, nothing.
Okay, no, because I saw the box light up. On Zoom.
Yeah, I saw it too.
Dife stopped breathing when she saw that box. No, but I was going to name Paula. Yeah, thank you so much for naming. And I think often when folks lived in marginalized identity, often in your youth, that's kind of what that time looks like, and particularly in youth, right? We have to name that in youth, like what is a youthful activity? Drinking, grabbing a drink, like let's go, especially in New York City, like let's go grab a drink. And I think she's navigating like this discomfort, absolutely, just to be able to find where she fits in. And then sort of the brilliance of, we're reading this as she's already named herself. So like kind of that struggle it took for her to get to this point of naming herself is really awesome and not easy. I think there was a poem I wanted to read. Let me find it. But if someone finds something before me, please.
I was just going to say a little bit about what we were talking about the homophobia and Audrey and Harlem. And I was just thinking, like, from when she was such a little girl, she was so like rambunctious and her mother couldn't control her. And she had such a spirit like of like independence or like having who she was. And even though she, you know, she didn't even, the sexuality thing, it took her a long time to actually realize and figure it out and name it. But like it had always been there from the time she was like such a small little girl, about her like having to strike out, you know. And last week people talked about what it meant for her at 18 to leave home and be on her own. And so I was just thinking that even if she couldn't name it, the whole piece about her sexuality, like, you know, and when she was at Hunter and that group of girls, the branded people spoke about last week, and yeah, maybe they were just radicals and all different kinds of outside the box, but I think they also were girls who were kind of cuddling and sleeping with each other even when they weren't having sex. And it's just like this constant outside the box kind of life that she was leading, you know, kind of grabbing for or insisting on being able to have, or she always was seeking communities of people like those girls in high school. And I could see her going to the Village, because the Village was, you know, not just where the gay people were, but it was kind of where the artists were and where the people who lived outside the box were. And it seemed like that was what she was always, that was like the path she was on, even if she hadn't realized it, named it, knew what it was, but that was the path she was creating and she was on, was that. And if she was going to explore her sexuality, she could not do it in Harlem. She had to go and find a place like the Village, you know, where there were gay bars. And even if she didn't drink, you know, like I'm also queer and I'm older. And, you know, there was a time like there was no place you could be out uncomfortable unless you went to a gay bar. You know, because that's the only place that the gay community was allowed to come together and just hang out and be gay. And even that was overshadowed by the police and the heavy duty repression. You know, we think about Stonewall in '68, you know, and the drag queens who kind of came, you know, just went out into the street when the cops, you know, came to raid that bar, you know, and that was the history, you know. It's really interesting. Like, you know, so that's another way in which she was just so, you know, courageous, that she pursued what she knew about herself without having yet been able to name it, her sexuality, under those conditions where she couldn't live in Harlem and pursue that. And she had to go down to the white village to pursue that, and that she took that on and created a life and created a community, figuring that out all along the way. And, you know, like you said, Paula, and that was a very lonely life, you know, to be in these communities, but these communities that were so isolated and outside the box and marginated. Anyway, I just wanted to speak to that.
No, thank you. And I think that speaks to the irony. Well, you didn't use the word irony, Paula, but I hear the irony of just then not being able to find that where you're from, having to go to so many other places. And that's where that loneliness kicks in, because I think there must be reminders all the time of how not only are you othered, but you're othered in a way that like no one from here is sort of like me. You know what I mean? What must that look like in those groups? And it's a little long, but I think we should read it because it fits in exactly with what we're talking about. So if you're able, follow me along on page 181, and we're gonna hit the 1, 2, 3rd paragraph, where she says, in a paradoxical sense, hold on, before we even continue, Audrey's a clown. Sometimes it's like, she uses terms, right? Paradoxical sense, but I recognize that she's trying to be facetious. She's trying to be funny. You know what I mean? Because I think there is no way to choose one or the other, but let's continue. No more side notes from me. We're going to go through the whole thing. In a paradoxical sense, once I accepted my position as different from the larger society, as well as from any single sub-society, Black or gay, I felt I didn't have to try so hard to be accepted, to look femme, to be straight, to look straight, to be proper, to look nice, to be liked, to be loved, to be approved. What I didn't realize was how much harder I had to try merely to stay alive, or rather stay human. How much stronger a person I became in trying that. But in this plastic, anti-human society in which we live, there have never been too many people buying fat Black girls born almost blind and ambidextrous, gay or straight. Unattractive too, or so the ads in Ebony and Jet seem to tell me. Yet I read them anyway, in the bathroom, on the newsstand, at my sister's house, whenever I got the chance. It was furtive reading, but it was an affirmation of some part of me, however frustrating. If nobody's going to dig you too tough anyway, it really doesn't matter so much what you dare to explore. I had already begun to learn that when I left my parents' house. Like when your Black sisters on the job think you're crazy and collect money between themselves to buy you a hot comb and straightening iron on their lunch hour and stick it in anonymously in your locker in the staff room, so that later when you come down for a coffee break and open your locker, the damn things fall on the floor with a clatter, and all the 95% of your library coworkers who are very, very white want to know, what's that all about? Or like when your Black brother calls you a ball buster and tricks you up into his apartment and tries to do it to you against the kitchen cabinets, just as he says to take you down a peg or two, when all the time you'd only gone up there to begin with fully intending to get a little in the first place, because all the girls I knew who were possibilities were too damn complicating, and I was plain and simply horny as hell. I finally got out of being raped, although not mauled, by leaving behind a ring and a batch of lies, and it was the first time in my life since I had my parents' house that I was in a physical situation which I couldn't handle physically. In other words, the bastard was stronger than I was. It was an instantaneous conscience raiser. As I say, when your sisters think you're crazy and embarrassing and your brothers want to break you open to see what makes you work inside, and the white girls look at you like some exotic morsel that just crawled out of the walls onto their plate, but don't they love to rub their straight skirts up against the edge of your desk in the college literary magazine office after class? And the white boys all talk either money or revolution, but can never quite get it up. And then it doesn't really matter too much if you have an afro longer before the word even existed. So if there's any confusion, she gives it to us right there in a simple 5-line, I would say poetic prose, 5 to 6 paragraph poetic prose. She's saying a lot. She's giving us a personal experience to really support or name like the bigger idea or the bigger theory, right? She drops that in a couple times. But she's letting us know this shit ain't easy. And regardless of my identity, I'm not pursuing it like actively, excitedly. I'm more trying to survive more than anything at this time. All the political things and all, like they've shifted me, they've impacted me, but I'm actually still with my head above the water. young, black, fine, and I don't know what's going on. Gonna have sex with who I want to have sex with because it's not even about identity. It's about like human need, right? She names that. And I think it's important when we talk about her bravery and her courage and her genius, which is something I always go to, like, oh, she's so brilliant, she's so genius. We have to in hand hold how difficult that is. And it sometimes makes me feel like the problems in her life can be centered around her awareness and the way she identifies herself and how those things counteract how she has to navigate the world, right? But I also, the way she writes, I sometimes feel like it has nothing to do with that. This is just the world and this is just the way it is. And she's tried her best this entire time. Such a powerful, powerful place to write from. It's powerful for me as the reader, for us. That was a long one, right? But you liked it. I liked it. Yeah, that was a good one. Is there anything else that's standing out to folks around that part that maybe focus on we just read? Is there something that maybe you heard aloud again and was like, oh, wow, I didn't realize that? Or like, oh, yeah, I appreciate that she wrote that.
Well, I'm getting a glimpse into the era, and probably she's representing, other women of her stature and her. It just, it was all like, I had no clue that this, what goes on in this world, in this country, but she's making it very plain, like you say, and difficult, and it's a struggle, and, she's there to do what she has to do in order to please her senses. The loneliness part, I don't know. I don't know. There's people like that are lonely, and I don't know if they choose to be lonely, but kind of, I think she's choosing to be lonely. Up until the
Still a
point where
painful
she
choice.
meets
I
a
agree.
friend.
And I think that's still painful, like to make that choice, especially if she's naming like, these are the reasons why. Because a lot of people choose to be lonely, but they don't realize it. I agree with you. They'll be like, oh, I'm so lonely, but it's like, you're choosing that. But I think it's even more painful when you you kind of have to choose a loneliness, The part that a lot of that resonates with me every session, I geek out. But the part that really stood out to me was when she was talking about potentially hooking up with the dude. And she has to, when she says, I escaped being raped but not mauled. But prior to that line, when she says, that he's gonna take her down a notch or two, how many times, not in that exact setting, how many times I've been told that in my personality trait, either from a boss or from a man or from my parents or my family, like you need to take it, we take you down a notch or two. And that feeling of like, I don't know, having to dim yourself for safety, or having to dim yourself for other people's comfort, or having to dim yourself just to know that you can like make it out of that situation. That really was powerful for me and stood out to me. And I related to that deeply in many levels.
Can we go back? Do we choose to be lonely, or do we choose to be alone? I don't know if anybody chooses to be lonely. That feels like a result. Like if you can change your loneliness, you would, as far as a choice is concerned. And it's not easy. I'm not, I just don't want to throw this out there and say, why are you lonely? Just change your life. But I think that people who are lonely are accepting things that are out of their control, that are leading to them being isolated from, when I say isolated, I'm not just talking about physically or geographically, because you could be in the, you could be in the middle of a concert and be lonely. But I think that it's a condition, and I'm not a doctor, so don't don't take anything that I'm saying as you know, as the truth or whatever. But I just feel like loneliness is almost out of our control. Like we can't choose it.
I understand what you're saying, but I think also to Anna's earlier point is that we can name maybe that loneliness cannot be an active choice, but there are decisions that one can make that attribute to loneliness, especially if you're constantly feeling lonely, you're not doing work to sort of like find healing and resolve and be in community with folks and do things, you know, to counter the loneliness, then that can be a choice. And I know through the pandemic, I saw some people kind of make that choice. Like there were a lot of resources to kind of maintain community. And I know some people personally who shut a lot of that out, and they're not necessarily in that now, but they chose a loneliness for a time and were in a suffering and then was like, you know what, this is too much. Like I have to get back into community. And they're not in partnership necessarily, and they're not alone, but I think our choices emphasize our access to feeling lonely, you know? Definitely. It's not the same, but, and I know I'm young and I'm gonna say this and y'all gonna laugh, but I'll give you, y'all can laugh at me. I'm young. I have not been in partnership. Anais, I love you. Come back next week. Thank you, Anais. You changed us today. You changed our life. I'm not in partnership with anyone. I haven't had a, wow, this is gonna be recorded for the internet, so shout out to this. I haven't had a boyfriend or a partner since I was 20 years old. I'm gonna be 32 in January. I haven't had a partnership, and I'm young, so it doesn't matter. You're like, boohoo, whatever, girl, figure it out. But what I'm naming is that there are times where I certainly feel lonely, you know, I understand. And I'm like, wow, I didn't seek this. These are the circumstances of my life because of choices out of my control. I'm not in partnership. I'm not connected to anyone. I'm not near my family. I'm not near my friends. Like I'm alone. And then I kind of have to make choices to not get out of it, but to lead myself into something that feels less intense or less lonely. You know what I mean? And I think to your point, Audrey's not doing that. She's not wallowing necessarily, but she's saying this shit is hard and it's lonely. Whether I choose it or not, it's still lonely. It still sucks. And I think if the world were as oppressive and crazy and not welcoming to your identity, you would choose it too. You would protect yourself as well. You know, you
used another word. You said protect now.
That because I think choosing loneliness does come from a space of protection, or choosing to not put yourself out there. You're trying to maintain whatever's here. And
But
you're
I
afraid that
really
if you know.
also, Paula, I understand what you're saying, but I still feel on one level, loneliness also happens from a social level. Okay. And
That's the level I'm describing as well.
Right, but there are people who I believe do not have a choice. And sometimes it's an issue of not even knowing how to get out. You know, remember, I mean, we live here in New York City, okay? But the majority of even our country and this world does not live in a town like us, okay? You know, even right here in the United States, people live in their little towns, their little houses. Most people in the United States don't even know, have never in their lives even taken a train. How many people in the United States do you think take a train to work every day?
But I want to be careful not to, I don't want to name that just because you're from a big city, you don't experience that kind of loneliness. I want to be careful not to name that, because I think that point is
lonely also.
Yeah, and I think the geography doesn't matter, but I want to get on your page. I think what you're naming is that the access to other people, the foot traffic, the access to folks, seeing folks, that is totally different. Yeah.
There are circumstances that will program a person. You know, this is almost like I saw a situation of a girl who was being, you know what domestic violence is? And the main advice that we were able to give her is, listen, you're better off without a partner, because her attitude was, but in my culture, by the time we get to a certain age, we're supposed to be married and we're supposed to at least have, you know, a partner. This, you see what I'm saying? And she felt so out of place that she took what was being, I mean, she almost ended up getting killed. Okay, she actually did. And the main advice that had to be given to her was, listen, you're better off being all by yourself than to have to be dealing with that.
In this time and space in her life, yes, but we are not to name that that's the true solution for her entire life, which is why I'm saying I don't think it's either or. I think it's what Ron and Anna are both saying. I think the idea of loneliness is dependent on the choices we make and our ability to sort of emphasize that and deconstruct them. And to what you're saying, RG, it's true. So many people don't have those choices. And I think that's something Ron said earlier too. Sometimes it's circumstances outside of their control. You know, those people, someone could have chosen that kind of marriage and that kind of life and still been very lonely. You know what I mean? And so, yeah, I want to be careful to name that. Maybe it's not the specifics of loneliness, but I think what we're naming together and with what Audre is always naming, right, is that the journey itself, navigating another identity and having to navigate different levels of oppression is what makes it lonely. You know, the difficulty of life and circumstances that changes with everyone, you know, but and then I'm thinking too about like neurodivergent people, right? Like people who don't necessarily communicate, people who communicate on a higher or a lower level of autism, who are on the spectrum, or folks who just don't communicate in a societal norm, right? And who are neurodivergent, who folks who read off as awkward or who read off as unfriendly, but some of the friendliest, kindest folks you'll meet are neurodivergent, right? And it's even difficult for them. And that, I used to be a teacher. You're like, girl, how old are you? I know, I used to be a teacher, and a lot of my community was made up of neurodivergent students, and sort of seeing even how that plays in an early age, like their choices around their loneliness and or what's out of their control. So I'm just naming, we're all right. And I don't think there's a specific, like you can choose loneliness because of the circumstances of your life and have to try to find a way to get back into it. You know what I'm saying? My hands are here because Anna's here, Ron is here, and RG's down here. So I'm trying to pull everyone's thoughts. Do folks agree with that? Do folks disagree? Like,
what's that saying that says, tell me who your friends are and I'll tell you who you are, something like that? Nobody's
that's the
heard
gist
that
of it.
saying?
Yeah, something like that.
So it's like, you know, she hasn't met that crowd yet. I mean, she's met it in Mexico, but she is not going to find it here in New York in the 50s, 60s, because it's difficult. It's difficult. So it's like you could choose to be lonely, or you have to be lonely, because if she hangs out with men, men are going to just take advantage of her or bring her down a peg. Now, if your mother tells you to come down a peg, that's different than your boyfriend or a man going back.
But I disagree with that notion, though. I think that there's a different intention, of course, because one is your boyfriend and another is your mother, but both are telling you that you're too much. And I'm saying that because I've already shared with the group that this is like an experience that I've had in my own life. And I'm naming loneliness because, again, the only reason why I brought up relationship is because whatever age I am, there is an expectation. And I also, you know, I love y'all. Y'all are family. I'll be very clear. I suffer with depression, severe depression. And I've suffered from depression since I was a child. And sort of, so again, things that are out of my control, right?
That's it.
Things that are out of my control, and that loneliness, that protection, that's come up, and that's been a barrier and something I had to deal with in life. So when Audre writes about how she had the keys, she was young, Black, gay, and fine, and it was hell, I deeply relate to the understanding of just having to navigate and having to be out there in a world that may not necessarily see that and welcome that. And I think we all do to some extent. I'm not talking from a high horse. I think we all have that, you know? And I think that's also what makes this part of the book so juicy. because it's one of the first times that I feel in alignment with her. I'm like, oh yes, in my womanhood, I know that feeling to be true. You know what I mean?
You think she's depressed? There's
I
a form of
think when you're
depression.
brilliant and you're a genius, I didn't call myself these words, but I think
I think
when
you
you're
did.
brilliant,
I think you did.
no, I certainly not. I'm talking Audre Lorde level genius. I think we know this, all geniuses and all brilliant people are sort of, they carry a lot. It's burdensome. And I think, I don't know if a clinical I'm not a doctor either. Ron and I are not doctors. That's the big takeaway from today. But I think that if you are insanely talented and you have these forms of expressing yourself brilliantly, I think it's because you carry a lot in the world and you're able to hold that, see that, name that. And I think having to heal on your own can be depressing. So even if she's not depressed, I feel that she certainly has experienced it and knows it. And she's dying while she's writing the book. So maybe a little bit as she's writing these words. Remember, her cancer comes back the second time, right? She's in her relapse as she's writing the book.
Oh, I
Maybe
didn't know that.
we don't know her life, but maybe there's a part of her that is a little sad, you know? And that's important to take in as well. Not too much though. And I want to say that I've shared a lot of vulnerable things about myself tonight with y'all. So I just want to thank y'all for holding that space.
Thank
You know, you raised
I got
something
friends.
that
I ain't that lonely. Like, come on now. What?
you raised something that we hadn't considered, that there is a psychological impact that colors her actions. And we know growing up in that household, there was a lot of turmoil and trauma there. So she might have had some emotional, psychological issues that were not addressed,
Right.
that play into how she sees the world.
Totally. And then again, aside, and thank you, D-Faye, because you said that, and now I'm thinking outside of the circle of her house and her community, then like McCarthyism and all of the socio-political things that are happening around her. Nothing in the world is necessarily allowing her to be okay, right, about who she is and how she has to navigate it, and nor does it make it easy.
On top of all that. But remember, our culture does not allow for us to be psychoanalyzed during that time. You know, even now, we don't go to psychiatrists. We don't, you know, because, but she had a lot in her, you know, in her pile. Just.
I was thinking back, you used the word protect a while ago, Paula.
I did.
And I was thinking about, and I was thinking about the relationship of sort of self-protection and loneliness, and you know, you protect yourself to avoid hurt. And she's really brave for someone. She's not defensive. She's fearless.
Yeah.
But I think about the people who she was really close to, like Muriel. And Muriel is, and Jenna, the girl who committed suicide. Jenny. Jenny. And she clearly knows that she's fragile, and they recognize that in each other. And in a sense, the bond there, and I don't know what happens. I'm only just up to the reading where we are now, but it sounds like there's sadness ahead, but the bond there is recognizing that they're both damaged and fragile, because everywhere they turn, it's like it's people, family, racism, politics, everything is hitting them. And to a certain extent, the relationship, and then when you sort of start thinking about it, that's what made your word protect made me think about it. Her relationships, Eudora was everybody's, they connect through their being damaged in part, but that's also a way of being seen and recognized and not lonely. And it's a double-edged sword, because it's not lonely, but it also is, it's fragile in all kinds of ways. So I don't, that just came to mind.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think there's a softness that they have. So I think that in these relationships that she has with these friends, and I think making that connection with protection, it makes sense, because then in all these other places, you kind of have to protect. And with this one other person, you don't have to be so hard. Defense. When I say protect, I also think defend, right? Like my mind kind of goes there.
So she says she's an Amazon, so yeah.
Exactly. So warrior. Can anyone relate to this feeling sort of it's particularly in your youth, you know, maybe give me some advice. No, but particularly like in your youth, naming in your 20s, in your 30s, just thinking about like, were you able to name who you were? Or do you think maybe upon reflection, you were still trying to figure out things, or you were like, look, by the time I hit 35, I knew who I was. Maybe it's because you were a parent, maybe, you know, I don't know. But can folks kind of relate to where Lorde is in this moment? Because she still hasn't named herself. And you don't have to give me your whole life story. Just if you could relate, you can nod your head. You know, have you ever been in a situation? Have you been in that? Yeah. Thank you.
Ron, talk.
I feel like I'm in it now. Ron, talk. I feel like I'm in a
guy here. I want a guy's perspective.
I can only give a personal perspective. not a
Yeah, please don't
guy's
give me no guy's perspective. I don't want to hear no guy's perspective. Thank you, Paula. But let's go real quick to page. Wait, someone was saying something? No, okay. Let's go real quick to page. Oh my goodness, I lost it. Here we go. I wanted to read, or I wanted someone else to read. And we don't have to read it actually, but just the part about the nightmare, her nightmare and her old house. That was chapter 25, and it's a poem. And if someone gets the page before me, I'd be grateful, child, because I'm gonna have slippery fingers. Oh, I found it, page 198. All right, I got time. We're gonna read it real quick. It's shorter than the other part. Again, before we get into it, just naming that Audre, from time to time throughout this biomythography, she plays with so many different forms of prose and so many different forms of telling a story. Sometimes she's telling us her feelings. Other times she's recounting it exactly as she remembers it to happen. And we're supposed to take that, you know, just the way she's saying it. And other times, which is my favorite, and she doesn't do it a lot, is when she inserts other writings, right? Her actual writings. And we see these in italicized font. And sometimes they're poems or journal entries or submissions, right? So here we have the last of my childhood nightmares on page 198 on the bottom. My mother's house, July 5th, 1954. Hickory-skinned demons with long white hair and handsome demonical eyes stretch out arms wide as all tomorrow. Across the doorway, exit from a room through which I run, screaming, shrieking for exit. But I cannot stop running. If I collide with those long arms bearing my pathway out, I will die of electrocution. As I run, I start to shout in despair, "Our Father who art in heaven," and the arms start to dissolve and drip down the walls and the air between the door and me. I then pass into another room of my parents' home, their bedroom, the room in which I am now asleep. It is dark and silent. There's a watermelon shaped like an egg on the bureau. I lift the fruit up and it drops down upon the linoleum floor. The melon splits open, and at the core is a brilliant hunk of turquoise, glowing. I see it as a promise of help coming for me. Ria is asleep, still in my parents' large bed. She is in great danger. I must save her from the great and nameless evil in this house, left here by the hickory-faced devils. I take her hand. It is white and milky in the half dark. And then suddenly I realize that in this house of my childhood, I am no longer welcome. Everything is hostile to me. The doors refuse to open. The glass cracks when I touch it. Even the bureau drawers creak and stick when I try to close them. The light bulbs blow out when I switch on the light. The can opener won't turn. The egg beater jams mysteriously. This is no longer my home. It is only of a past time. Once I realize this, I am suddenly free to go and take Rhea with me. What's she talking about? We got 11 minutes on the session, folks. What's she talking about?
It
Anna.
reminded me, my sister, my younger sister, she came out and my family just had such an adverse reaction. My brother, the He-Man, he punched the wall. And my mother, I think, threw her out of our home. So it kind of reminds me of that. I think she's talking about her parents when she refers to demons. And, you know, it's sad, but that's the way they made her feel. That whole family, that whole, you know, because they are Caribbean, right? They're not, yeah, you know, and and they were strong, and they're not going to accept, you know, homosexuality in any form, shape or form or whatever. And that's, you know, that's what came to my mind when my youngest sister came out, and everybody was like, and they said, oh, I thought Anna was going to be, so it's like, you know, because I was a tomboy and everything, but they never thought that my younger sister would come out, and she did. And, you know, she's happy. She got married last year, and she's living in Florida, and she's most happy with her woman.
Thank you for sharing. Is there anything, what else? What's happening here? What is she writing about?
I thought she was writing about her mother, that ghost represented her mother. And she finally freed herself from her mother's psychological grasp and emotional grasp on her too. And all of the nightmares that came from living in that household. Now she's free of it because she realizes she can't fit. It's over.
That's the part I wanted to highlight, that freedom, right? After this memory, she lets go. It's over. D-Faye, you just said it's over.
Yeah. Can't go home again.
Yes. Because that's not welcome anymore, right? And I don't know if it's her energy that's not welcome, which even though that's how she writes it, I took it more of a reader as like, that energy is not welcome in her life, right? Like she's on her own path, her own journey. It's not even gonna go well, you know?
Does anybody know if she ever reconciled with her mother or sisters?
Let's look it up. I'll look it up.
Google, yeah.
I just thought it was really interesting that it's not that she escapes, is that she gets Rhea out.
Yeah.
That's why I was so grateful for Anais for telling us what she told us, because that's such a powerful part of the dream, that she actually helps someone else escape the danger. And what she told us really goes a long way to explaining how deep that bond was with her.
Well, wasn't it the other way around? Was it Rhea? I don't know. Was that the one she lived with in Mexico?
No, she lived with Eudora in Mexico.
But Rhea was her roommate.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, okay.
So
in New York, right? What's that ringing?
I can't find anything about her mom. The only thing I'm aware of is how she writes about the erotic mother. Yeah, she just has the poem on the erotic mother. There's no information in the 2 seconds that I took to check the internet. So maybe in some more extensive research, you'll be able to find. Maybe that's what I'll do. That'll be my homework for our next.
That's your home. Oh, that's not DeFaye's homework.
Hey, Anna, stay in your lane.
Yeah, I'm like, D-Faye, she's trying to give you homework.
I'm wondering about the fact
That's
that
the teacher
my
in
mother
me.
had probably already passed away. Is her mother still around when she writes this book? I don't think so.
82.
No,
And-
but I want us to get to the end of the book before we assume what happens to her mom. Yeah.
And I think the word reconcile, she probably accepted, you know, after a while, I think she came to a realization that there are people and things in this world that we really cannot change. But we have to be the ones to be at peace, you know? And I think she recognized that with her parents. Because it is family. And there's one thing that none of us, hey, we don't choose who our mom is going to be or who our dad is going to be. We don't, that's the one part in this world that we really don't get to choose. Okay, but every single body that comes into this world has to have a mom. And I think that's the one thing, because I always want to imagine what would happen if we were able to choose our parents. There would probably be even more chaos. Okay, we be divorcing them and carrying on. Okay. I always wondered that, but so sooner or later in life, we get to a point where we do understand that, yeah, I think it was wrong what her mom did, but I also feel that it's part of that culture, and parents often feel that they're trying to show you how to survive in society. And I think she did come to that understanding. Understanding something doesn't mean that we accept it. I think understanding something means that we allow ourselves to look at the explanation of why it happens. But I think acknowledging something doesn't mean that I have accepted that.
No.
Okay.
Yeah. But that may be the closest to a reconciliation that she may get. We can't assume that everybody in this position gets a full on, you know what I mean? Like that can be someone's definition of reconciliation. And you know, I want to note that we don't know how she's feeling right now around her age at this point in the book, not where she's writing it from, but sort of like where she is. So that'd be curious for us to figure out in our last little chapters of reading, if she actually mentions her parents again and sort of what that means. And it'd be really great to also, on a side note, if you want to, you can read The Erotic Mother. And it's literally a really long essay manifesto, kind of a poem writing that she has around sort of the relationship between like the motherly body, Mother Earth, and the body and anatomy, and then her own mom. So it's like it's really interesting. I don't want to give any tools away.
You know, her mother is very intriguing to me. Her strength, the Caribbean upbringing, the fact that she's light enough to pass and uses it on occasion. And I would just love to know, if she'd been able to, what Audre thought about her mother once she became of age and had some life experience. Yeah, that mother is very interesting, because she's the way she is because of how she was raised. And the mother also gives strength to Audre is who she is because of some of the strength her mother has, and some of that was passed along. So the mother's very interesting character.
I'd be interested to see, thank you, Dife, and for Audre for bringing up the original point. I'd be interested to see how her mother's relationship, or what that looks like, how that lends to her own relationship as a mother. Because as we know, Audre herself is a mother as well. Right?